All right, shall we start then?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Hello, everyone, and happy May 15. As you know, today is the 9th anniversary of the Spanish Revolution, El 15M, so something to celebrate. Hi, and I'm pleased to meet Helena Norberg-Hodge. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm very happy to be here.
For those of you who don't know Helena, you might be looking at her biography on the screen. She's the co-founder of Local Futures, pioneer of the worldwide localization movement. She's a recipient of the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Gold Peace Prize, and the Arthur Morgan Award. She's also an author of the inspirational classic Ancient Futures and a producer of the award-winning documentary, The Economics of Happiness. Also the author of her latest book, we'll discuss later today, Localization and De Growth. Anything you want to add about your biography, Helena?
No, but maybe perhaps hemos vivido en España, hablo un poco español, pero hace mucho tiempo que no hablo y por eso hablaremos en inglés.
Okay, gracias, thank you. Also, I want to say a big thanks to the whole team, Sean, Anya, Mariana, Laura from Local Futures. I don't have all your pictures, but some of them there. Also to Mar from Pol-len Editions, the publisher, to Pedro from Libero, who helped us with the crowdfunding campaign, to my own team, the whole team that made possible the Spanish version of the book. Thank you very, very much for all your help and support. So about a year ago, I bought your book, Helena. I have it with me here in English. And reading it, it inspired me so much that I reached out to your organization and asked whether you had a Spanish translator. And bingo, your colleague Sean Keller replied and expressed interest in the idea, and the conversation started from there. So here we are a year later. The book has been translated. 260 people have pre-ordered it through the crowdfunding campaign, a successful one. Just ended a couple weeks ago. And it will be published and delivered next month, in June. And here we are. I'm about to interview you, a true legend of the economics of happiness. So to everyone listening today, dreams and ideas do come true. Just have to believe and have to surround yourself with a good team and perhaps get a little lucky too as well.
Actually, I also want to mention, I don't usually do this, but I want to mention that it's very appropriate that the book's coming out in June, because you may have heard that we're planning this big online event called World Localization Day on June the 21st. So I hope that all the listeners will look that up, worldlocalizationday.org, and do everything they can to get more people onto that event. It's going to be an online event, and we're trying to make much more visible and to celebrate the existing localization movement that is actually happening around the world, but it hasn't always thought of itself as one cohesive movement. But so, and I'm very happy to meet you, Jesus. I didn't realize that you speak such good English.
Thank you. Spent a couple years in the US back in the day.
I see.
All right, wonderful piece of information. World Localization Day on June 21st online. Check it out, worldlocalizationday.org.
Yeah.
All righty, so let's then get started with the interview. So in the very first sentence of your book, Helena, and I quote here, you say, for a species to have a future, it must be local. So why is that?
It is because our economic system, our global economic system, is proceeding in a way that makes it fundamentally anti-life. We have not seen the contours of this vast global system where a very few number of people and a few number of businesses have become so large and so global that they cannot respect diversity. And diversity is a fundamental principle, a fundamental fact, fundamental necessity of life. So an economic system that ignores and destroys diversity, biological, cultural, and even individual. We are not able to be our unique selves in this system. So that system is on a collision course with life, and we are seeing that we are facing very, very serious consequences from that system, which not only ignores and destroys diversity, but is based on using and eating up more and more of our scarce natural resources. Energy, minerals, soil, it's decimating the soil. We're supposed to be productive with large-scale farms, and actually what's happening is that those farms are much less productive than smaller diversified farms. So we must shift in the direction of localizing, meaning adapting economic activity to the diversity of natural environments and the diversity of cultures. Doesn't mean eliminating trade. It doesn't mean that everything happens at some tiny local level, but we must move in the direction of shortening the distances between production and consumption.
All right, thanks a lot. So I forgot to mention that, of course, you can check out Helena's book in English and Spanish. In Spanish through the publisher's website, Pol-len.cat. Also, you can post questions on the chat window, and we will compile and reply to them at the end in about 30 minutes or so. All right, next topic. You have here a slide with the more or less the items that we're going to cover eventually. Now moving to the current pandemic. It's been laid bare that globalization and growth, as you were mentioning, have created enormous inequalities and injustices, and have left many people highly vulnerable, even in poverty, and are also disrupting the natural ecosystems we depend upon, as you were mentioning. So do you think this is somehow of an opportunity, besides all the suffering, of course, to really make a critical mass of people realize of the flaws and the the failures of globalization and growth and the risks that it poses to us, and perhaps people are more open-minded now to the systemic changes that are needed? Do you think this is the time for actually bringing together this critical mass of people?
I think without a doubt that we can see everywhere that there's more doubt about dependence on the global supply chains that are not even, I mean that we in our countries don't even supply medical equipment that's basic and simple. It's become very, very clear that we become very vulnerable and that it's a dangerous situation to be so dependent. I wish we had heard more in the pandemic about how dangerous it is to be dependent on a global food supply in this way. A lot of people don't realize how economies worldwide have been hollowed out as people have been encouraged to do larger and larger scale production for export. So we're so dependent on importing our basic foodstuffs from far away. So there's no doubt that people are more open to rethinking, and at every level. However, we do have in place very powerful vested interests that, from my point of view, are so blind because they are part of such a large-scale system again, that they are not being forced to recognize how destructive it is to continue to push for this type of deregulation, which is what globalization is. It's been a process of trade treaties whereby global banks and corporations have gained more and more freedom, to the point that in the last 30 years, they have been essentially telling governments what to do. They have clauses in trade treaties now where governments are signing in black and white, we won't do anything that might reduce your profit-making capacity. Now, this is the most absurd and really insane, total destruction of democracy. It's making a complete joke of democracy. And yet most people don't know about it. And even many people in the financial casino, the global financial casino, that are sitting there at their computers speculating on our lives, on our mortgages, on the value of our food, on the value of our currencies. Many of those people don't even know about these trade negotiations and these treaties that I think most people would have to reject if they have any sense of both sustainability and social justice. They would absolutely have to reject those treaties. So it's very, very important that we put a lot of effort into raising awareness. And I feel when I say that, I want to add that it's so important that we do it without casting blame at individual corporations, individual CEOs, particular rich people, particular governments, because what we have been studying for the last 40 years is that governments, both from the left and the right, have gone along with these trade negotiations. And even, unfortunately, the Green parties have not been raising awareness about this centrally important role of this deregulation of trade in goods, but also trade in money, this speculative casino. And I believe that we could get huge support for the idea that we need new treaties. We need treaties that are democratically accountable to the voter, to society, to determine certain basic rules for business. And that will mean also that businesses will not be allowed to be registered in a place but move around freely wherever they choose, blackmailing governments. So what we mean at one level about localization is that every business needs to be place-based. It needs to belong to a particular place and adhere to the rules of that place. Now, today, the most logical first station will be the nation state. But as we wake up to the need to localize, particularly in primary production, fishery, forestry, and farming, we're actually going to want to decentralize even more and build a system that clearly recognizes that you want to have something like food that everyone needs every day, travel much shorter distances, and that in turn is linked to markets. In other words, market pressure on the producers to diversify. So this is that fundamental biological reason why we must localize, because we must protect and restore biodiversity. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect sense. You covered a lot of topics. Wonderful. Do you think this global health crisis has made people understand clearly that we cannot be isolated in either as individuals or communities? We're all part of the same, interdependent universe or even planet. So we're all in the same boat in a way. And you think we can make sure that we cooperate globally, even as we focus on local communities, but we cooperate globally through more democratic means, as you were referring to make sure the values and the means of cooperation and solidarity become essential to the new normal that we build in, rather than individuality and selfishness and trying to depend on technology rather than people. So do you think these values will somehow prevail in this conversation towards the new normal?
Well, I think one thing that's definitely happened is that both at the very local level, there has been a flowering of community initiatives, a type of self-organizing, spontaneous mutual aid societies that have sprung up all over the world. I was talking to my friend Joanna Macy in America the other day, and she was talking about how inspired and just hopeful she is, optimistic she is, after seeing the response of ordinary people coming together in human scale, community groups, and even while keeping their social distancing, they're managing to organize in ways that they support the marginalized, that they make sure that food and essential needs are available to everyone. Of course, this isn't happening everywhere, but it is happening all over the world, and it's happening in such large numbers that it gives one huge hope and inspiration. But I want to also say that for us, it's very important to emphasize the fact that there's been a lot of idealism in the peace movement, in the, generally on the political left, about solidarity, and particularly solidarity across the world. But we haven't realized that the whole process of so-called growth, which has not actually meant that our economy has been growing. We've actually been getting poorer. The average person is having to work longer hours to just pay for their food and their rent. So the majority of people are getting poorer as the economy is growing. But what we haven't realized is that that path of growth has so hollowed out and destroyed those face-to-face community relationships, and equally importantly, the relationship to the plants, to the animals, to the soil, to the water, to the life that supports us. And as that gets hollowed out, and we end up frightened, competitive, in our isolated, fossil fuel-based cement, high-rise dwellings, and we're there fighting for artificially scarce jobs, it's very hard to feel solidarity with the rest of the world. And so we want to emphasize how important it is to create that basic building block of human scale interdependence in order to provide the fundamental security that enables people to be loving, kind, and generous, even with people across the world. But I also, well, there's just so much to say. I hope people read my book, Ancient Futures, as well as Localized Our Future, because I talk a lot there too about how many well-intentioned people would be supporting what they see as poor people on the other side of the world, while actually destroying their self-respect and their self-reliance. So we need to understand why strengthening community and deep connection to local resources, the living life around us, is a foundation for healthier, happier, and truly wealthier ways of life in both parts of the world, in the more industrialized parts of the world, as well as the less industrialized, so-called South. But I do feel that both the skepticism about the global market and dependence on it, and the emerging community development now, as well as the slowing down. I think the slowing down has been a very important part of what's happened, that people have actually realized how much they enjoyed doing a bit less. I was talking to someone who's retired and who wasn't actually working, but now because of lockdown, he's saying, I feel I'm returning to pre-industrial life. I don't seem to be doing very much, but I'm enjoying my life much more. So there's been, for many, many people, a gift in this slowing down and this sort of inability to work. And of course, we realize that for people who are really frightened about the future and whose jobs and livelihoods might have been destroyed, it may be a different story. Although even there, I've met people who have said, yeah, I don't have a job, I don't have any savings, it's a bit scary, but everybody's in this boat together. So there too, the solidarity and the sense that we're in this boat together is a very important and a unifying factor with this pandemic. And of course, we've seen also examples of collaboration apparently among scientists and across borders. That's been very encouraging. However, I want us to be clear that generally speaking, the collaboration between our governments and between big businesses has not been so impressive. And this is another part of waking up to what's been going on, and that's to realize that sadly our national governments, even including my native country of Sweden, our national governments have been going down this path of supporting global business, providing corporate welfare while cutting back welfare to their poor in their population. So we need to have a bit of clarity about the fact that we're going to need to transform the political structures to regain genuine representation, genuine democracy. But it won't happen without a clear economic analysis, because it's unfortunately the globalizing economic path that has removed political power, even from government leaders.
All right, wonderful. So you pretty much covered the definition of localization and well-being with the elements of, as you were saying, strengthening community, reconnecting with nature, slowing down, recovering the sense of togetherness, and fundamentally rebuilding real democracy, shifting power back to the people, and also through this economic analysis from a systemic point of view that you were mentioning. So now in more concrete terms, but always along the same lines, a number of people, including myself, we are considering moving back to the land, back to rural areas, as a way to, on one hand, escaping crowded and competitive cities, stress and pollution, or on the other, longing to reconnect with nature and community, as you mentioned. So in this book, particularly at the end, in the conversation that you maintained with Wendell Berry, your friend from the US, you mentioned the importance of building diverse and intergenerational communities as essential ingredients, not only for survival, but also for well-being. So what would be your advice, Helena, for young people and young people at heart wanting to move back to the land, even for the first time?
Well, one bit of advice I want to give is that study the situation a little bit. I think the materials on our website can help. My book happens to have been, Ancient Futures, happens to have been a bestseller in South Korea, and they sold about 500,000 copies there. And I came back after several years. I hadn't realized that so many people had read it, but I was told then that it had led to quite a movement of people moving back to the land, but that they had found it very difficult, and many of them had found that they just couldn't make it. And I pointed out then that they hadn't really carefully digested my very strong message about the economic side of it. So now I would always urge people, please be aware of this fundamental difference between localizing and following the global path. Now, what that would mean is if you want to move out to the land, and if you think that you're going to grow food and survive and earn money from it, the ideal thing would be that you actually identify a group of consumers or some kind of co-op. It might exist already, or you might familiarize yourself with the many financial mechanisms, for instance, slow money in the United States, so that you get support from a consumer base that will be very appreciative and want to buy the products you produce. And to just move out of the land, and particularly in very small numbers, you're going against a whole system which for generations has been pushing in the opposite direction. Now, I absolutely don't want to urge you not to go back to the land, because I think that ultimately the easiest way to regain your well-being and your happiness will be to go back to the land. But I love to highlight projects where not only there's an awareness about how you might survive producing food and having some kind of income, because until we have a much, much bigger movement, you will need some money to survive. It's virtually illegal in our industrialized states now to try to live without money. So I love other examples, like in Dublin, I met a group that became inspired by our work and wanted to set up an eco community, go out to the land as a community. And I love the way they approached it. They actually met for more than a year in Dublin. And over that period, there were people who came and left. And so that it meant that they had ironed out a lot of differences in thinking and expectations. They got to know each other at a more deep level before they embarked on this very important transition. And then, I'm not sure exactly how successful it is now, but certainly that type of preparatory stage, I would say, is very important. And also do learn, you know, from other groups and other experiments. And I do think our website is quite a wonderful resource for those kinds of things. I also love, you know, another project that I think is very emblematic of the kinds of things that can work really well is one of the biggest urban communities that I know, which is in Seoul in South Korea, where now 20,000 people in Seoul are essentially a community. It's called Sangmisan. And they started, I'm trying to remember now, it was 20 years ago or something, but there was going to be a development that was going to destroy, a typical story, destroy the little bit of nature, a tiny little park on a hill. And the people in the area got together to prevent this development and succeeded. And out of all that collaboration and exchange came, you know, a real community fabric that went on to create local businesses that basically served that community of 20,000. They set up co-ops, they set up their own school. And as part of their school, they understood the importance of food production and teaching their children. So they would go out to the country and learn about farming. And now in recent years, some of them are moving out to a community and living permanently on the land. Now this migration away from the city to the land is something that needs to happen. And it doesn't mean that we're saying, from our point of view, that everyone should live in a tiny community on the land. But we are saying that if we understand how incredibly energy intensive, resource intensive, modern urban mega cities are, if we understand why everyone is being pushed, if they want a good job in the dominant economy, they have to go to the big city, almost without exception. And in those big cities, from Beijing to New Delhi to Barcelona to Berlin, in those cities, the price of housing is out of reach for most people. So often they have to commute for 3 hours a day, sometimes 6 hours a day, 3 hours back and forth. So it's a hellish existence to try to compete in that system. So we absolutely must look at policy change as well as individual change. And when I say we absolutely must, I don't mean that everyone should be going off to their national governments and start lobbying them. No, this is about us being the social, environmental, peace movements, starting to think more about policy and understanding the global system better, to have greater clarity about what we want. And we can stay with our single issue, but have our voices come together to ask for policy or to demand policy change. I might have jumped ahead and some other stuff we're saying later, sorry.
Don't worry, it doesn't matter. It's wonderful. building on this, and now moving towards the moment of opportunity that we're in, the crossroads, we find that this crisis. The Greeks had this double conception of time, one being chronos, the linear time, and the other one being kairos, the moment of opportunity. So do you think right now we can really take a leap forward and rethink our world, for instance, in terms of sustainable global management of the commons? By the commons, we mean the social and human rights, the climate, the biodiversity. There's a movement building up called the International Progressive Movement. I'm sure you're aware of, but even pushing for what's called the Earth Constitution, or ensuring social rights through more binding agreements and through economic means. And some specific economic means like the universal basic income are gaining traction in many parts of the world, particularly here in Spain right now with the pandemic. So what do you think in terms of how can we encourage people to dream big, not to be left in fear and of each other and in fear of governments and other countries and migrants, etc. So how can we encourage once again the expansion of the imagination and dreaming big and bringing people together to really rethink our world from scratch and totally take a leap forward? What would be your words of wisdom here?
Well, again, it's a little bit similar to what I said before, that there's been a huge amount of idealism in the peace movement and solidarity movements about the world we would love to have, but not enough of what I would call eco-literacy, meaning both economic literacy linked to ecological literacy. Now, this whole issue of biodiversity and how we maintain it, and generally the issue of diversity, both cultural and biological, has not been part of that discourse. So what we are finding is that as a consequence, people have had very idealistic goals, but they've been blind to the way, as I said earlier, that the intergenerational fabric, which actually you asked about before, but the intergenerational structures that existed in every society until industrialism have been broken down. And when we break down those naturally cooperative relationships, we're creating inherently more competitive structures. And not just that, we're creating identities that are so wounded and so fragile that it becomes extremely difficult to be open, compassionate, fearless. Loving and fearless becomes very difficult when your identity is fragile, when you're feeling that you've never been seen, you haven't been heard, you haven't been appreciated, you haven't really had the love that every child deserves and needs. So there are some basic, I call it eco-literacy. I was going to say there's some basic literacy here, but actually eco-literacy doesn't quite cover it because, we both need to understand how ecosystems function. But I'm also saying, totally not coming out of my head, I'm not saying this. I'm reporting what I experienced in ancient Ladakh and Bhutan, and later on found in other more indigenous cultures. So I was exposed to this truth that when you have those intergenerational relationships and you're in closer collaborative interdependence at a direct human scale level, you get a very different identity, a different sense of self, and you experience that the good of the individual is actually the same as the good of the group. So you're in a very, very different position from what you are if you ignore all of those factors and then think about solidarity and peace and, with the best of intentions. We mustn't ignore the foundations, the building blocks. What we have experienced is that when people understand these foundations and, for instance, help prisoners juvenile delinquents, addicts of every kind, men violent against women or children, a whole range of real, social breakdown and psychological illness. When people are helped to deeply connect face to face, in other words, that's what community should be about. And that means they have to be helped to be willing to be vulnerable, to be willing to say, I'm struggling, I'm not perfect. I have this problem, I have that problem, and I have this problem with my parents. And I'm not saying, this is something that happens overnight, but I am saying that it's almost like overnight, because I know so many projects where those really wounded, angry people, in a matter of weeks sometimes, could change by being helped to experience that joy of feeling more deeply connected and feeling that you're sharing a journey. There are some beautiful examples where when that is reinforced by a connection to nature, and I would say the most wonderful and most effective projects of this kind very often involve actually gardening or producing food. So you're actually productive as well as deeply interdependent with the living world and with others. And that formula literally in weeks can turn people around. So I believe that if we can all take those initial steps, turn the I to a we, practice that deep connection, that we can create human beings who will truly dream big. And it won't just be dreaming, they'll be experiencing something so big and so wonderful that they will absolutely want to share that and want to help spread the word, want to help make that a basic human right for all people. The basic human right to feel loved, respected, connected, have meaningful, productive work. But you see, the key is that we have to move off this essentially capitalist, corporate, global treadmill where we've been led to believe that the only way to be someone, to be important, is to be globally relevant. This is what's happened to football, to music, to all of us. We've got to be global stars or we're nobody. And so we've hollowed out the everyday, the ordinary, the people around us who could actually give us joy. I'm talking too long, sorry, I better.
No.
Anyway.
It's also enlightening. Thank you so much. So I take this message with me, really, and hopefully the audience too, that it's good to be idealistic. It's good to think about and dream about a new world, but it's even better to do it through practice and experience, and building and developing what you call the eco-literacy through different mechanisms like intergenerational structures or more cooperative mechanisms to actually create this sense of identity that you belong to something that is meaningful, where you are appreciated. And these are basically going back to the basics, to the foundations that make us humans, and through sharing, through caring, what's called the regenerative cultures, right? And reconnecting with nature. So yeah, wonderful message, especially for those of us that are very idealistic and sometimes forget about the practical ways of achieving it. So, but moving towards the macroeconomic again, we have a big problem here in Spain because of this, monoculture of the globalized economy. We focus too much on one particular sector, sometimes directly the European Union or the national governments, which is tourism. In our case, 15% of the GDP and jobs are related to tourism, directly or indirectly, 10% globally. And it's a globalized and non-basic industry, as you know, but many jobs depend on that, and so it's need to reinvent that deeply at the moment. And decision makers as well as economic agents are clueless about how to do this, and they even, creating or opening up these hackathons or this sort of co-creation platforms for people to share their ideas on how to reinvent and rethink tourism. So what would be your advice for both policymakers and economic agents and tourists in general, which we all are at some point, on how to reinvent this industry towards a more local, more sustainable, more fair approach, and also perhaps not relying so much on tourism, and how to diversify the national economy of Spain? Or what would you say to the government?
Well, I mean, I would say to the government, please look at re-examining these fundamental mechanisms that you use to shape the economy. And it's what you tax, what you subsidize, and what you regulate. So we've had this constant process of deregulating global businesses and global banks, giving them more and more freedom. In the meanwhile, every business that belongs to a place, that's place-based, even a national industry in Spain, is regulated and is more visible. You can see what they're doing, if they're polluting or how they're employing their workers. And those same place-based or localized businesses, they all pay tax. And in the meanwhile, those taxes have been used to subsidize the global players that don't pay tax and that aren't regulated. Now, what I'm saying here is true. It's basic, it's true, it's basic, and yet almost no one is discussing it. I don't know, it's like, I think very often on the left, the problem is that the assumption that the industrial path has brought so many benefits, so we can't question the fundamentals. But my learning came not from books, but from these ancient cultures. And I'm not saying we should go back and live like them, but by seeing that baseline, it became much clearer that to go down a path that requires more and more energy, more and more resources, and keeps replacing more and more people is madness on a crowded planet with limited resources. So the problem is not so much overpopulation, which is an issue, but the biggest problem is an economic system that makes those people redundant and then uses more and more resources to replace them. So I feel that tourism, farming, manufacturing of every kind, architecture, in medicine, in virtually every discipline you care to mention, we should be re-examining the basic economic drivers that have, for instance, pushed medicine towards larger and larger institutions. And that means also pushing the whole process of amalgamating hospitals into fewer and fewer big cities, abandoning the smaller towns and the villages. The schools, amalgamating, pushing them again. That fundamental process of centralizing, urbanizing, linked to globalizing, that's what we have to rethink. The new thinking then has to do with societies. So say we're talking about the Spanish government. The Spanish government needs to start stepping back to look at how do we create economic policies that are really going to benefit our people. We need to be looking then at a genuinely circular economy. Why do we want to run our economy on debt-based foreign investment? Why did we allow the European Central Bank to push so many loans on us to build massive hotels, out of fossil fuels, supposedly cheap, high-rise cement, monstrous, ugly? How do we allow the water to be diverted to build these tourist hotels? How do we allow that destruction of our landscape and of our society to just service some mass tourist industry? I think most people on left and right could be encouraged to start thinking more about the quality and also about the benefits to Spain's population, to Spain's resources, to its future well-being. And it would mean much less dependence on tourism. It would mean looking at how do we reduce our dependence? How do we create thriving, happy, healthy towns, communities, and villages where people will want to live? And when they travel, they won't feel a need to get into a plane and go to the other side of the world every year. How can we also encourage a slowing down so that if you do go around the world, it will be in ships that use partly wind power and wind sail. All of these things are totally doable. Be far cheaper, far less polluting to have ships made of wood. They don't need to be made of, of steel and plastic. Anyway, that might sound like dreaming, but I know people who are developing some boats like that, both for shipping some products and for use for people. So it is, I think, the fundamentals of how do we create this thriving economy for ourselves. Now, we have to really stress here that in local futures, we are promoting this from a global perspective. We are arguing that everywhere in the world, every community, every nation state should be looking at reducing its dependence on global corporations. This type of protectionism is not protecting us from one another. It's actually a journey of shared collaboration, really international collaboration, to move away from this system that has become so destructive. But remember, it's blind, and so much of it is raising awareness. Many of the people who are still pushing for more trade and deregulation and further globalization and centralization are really not aware of these connections. So I think there's a huge potential that through focusing more on education, public education, creating more materials, we would love, to have more visuals, more films, more animations to demonstrate these choices that we have now after COVID. Do we go into an even faster, more stressful, more competitive path that's going to be, we're going to be, it is so resource intensive, it's so energy intensive, and it's destroying people so rapidly that we're not going to get very far down that path before, again, there will be a huge wake up. But let's use this wake up to really put all our energy behind raising awareness about the potential for this much healthier, slower, human pace, human scale. And human scale, remember, small truly is beautiful. And if you don't know that book, I recommend everyone to read it. Small is Beautiful, written by a very respected economist. And it's basically saying small enough for human beings to see the impact of what they do. So when they see it, they can also take responsibility for what they do, how they use the earth and other people to provide for their own needs. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on too long.
No, don't be. It's wonderful to listen to you. So those are great tips for everybody, not only for the government. Hopefully some civil servant is among the audience.
Yeah.
But anyway,
nice.
Yeah. Small is Beautiful, great book recommendation. Thank you. Relocalizing the economy and our lives. This is also something I've been personally trying to do for a long while. It's on the one side, I work as an international consultant, but on the other, I'm trying to be more involved in local initiatives, little by little. So, just maintaining one foot on the system and the other on the transition. So it's difficult, but we're trying to find that balance. And your words of wisdom are very much welcome in that direction. So one last question before we move into the Q&A session with the audience. You pretty much covered the concept of resist and renew. But so I would like to focus on what you call big picture activism, which is a central part of the book. And I personally love this concept, really, because it really resonates with my own experience. I've been a member of different social movements over the years, and I always feel that we are very divided still, right? Very issue specific, and as a result, we don't reach the critical mass. And you were discussing this with your colleague Wendell Berry in the book, how we need to focus on intersectionality of movements and really and work together for the common good. And because most of the times we're reacting, defending, sort of, we defend this right or this species or this natural park, and in the end, the fight, the big fight is clearly on the losing end because of this predatory system. So we really need to promote big overhaul of the whole economic system, and not just small tweaks of policy changes here and there. So, but it's really difficult. For instance, in Spain, we have several prominent movements right now, like feminist movement, the climate movement, a little bit with the young people, and also the pensioners are pushing for reforms in the pension system, which is good. But we all divided once again. So what would be your advice, particularly for activists, to start sort of coming together and really aiming for a complete overhaul of the economic system? So focus on the economy rather than the social and cultural issues that divide us up.
Yeah. Again, I think it's so important that we don't just, have sort of this wishful thinking, we should all collaborate and so on. It's really about recognizing that the current economic path either created the problems we're trying to deal with, whether we're trying to protect the forest or deal with poverty or the pensioners or almost every single issue we're dealing with. The economic system has either created the problem or exacerbated what might have been traditional problems with perhaps the role of women or class or caste. Those problems have been massively exacerbated, made worse because of this economic system, much worse. So there's such an enormous amount to be gained if we can all realize that whatever our single issue, we will all benefit from focusing on the economy. And there's a third element too. Even if we don't believe that the economic system caused or made our issue worse, then we can show that whatever you're trying to do to protect the poor or the trees or whatever it might be is becoming more and more difficult because the money isn't there to do it. So again, it comes back to the economy. Who's making the money? Who decides the price of things in the marketplace? So we don't have to become economists. We don't have to spend years studying economics. In fact, please don't. What we're asking is that you spend a little bit of time to study the writings and the talks by people who have studied the economic system as a system, looking at that and its impact on people and nature. That's what we need to understand the basic structures, the basic elements. So that offers a huge potential for this coming together. So that bigger picture of this big global system that has been so big that most people just haven't seen it, they haven't been aware of it. And a lot of what's happened is that people blame themselves. It leads to not only individual self-blame, but this terrible thing of giving up on human beings. People say, human beings are so greedy, they don't care, they're destroying the environment. What's wrong with the human race? It's not the human race. It's an inhuman system. And it's inhuman particularly because it's so big, but it's also inhuman because a lot of what's happening now is literally algorithms. We don't want an algorithm to be sorting out activities across the world and making sure that in every country, the gap between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Every country. There's no exception that I know of. And in virtually every country, people know that it's an obscene gap, that it's a gap that is not ending up with some trickle down. It's a lie. It's just not true. So yeah, big picture activism is, to encourage people to look at that big economic system and to realize that you can do something right now that will inspire your sense of connection and empowerment by connecting with some like-minded people and turning the I to a we. So this is again where the very small and the very local becomes huge and important in giving us that sense of empowerment and hope and faith. I also just quickly wanted to say something about UBI, because we didn't talk about it before. And I just want to warn people, again, in a single issue way, if they focus on just UBI, I think we could have a big problem that it would just become maybe some crumbs to the bottom while the big system continues. And remember, the big system is not only creating this obscene gap between rich and poor, but it is destroying the actual economy. The water and the soil and the minerals and the resources that are the economy. This system is chewing them up, throwing them out, just like it's chewing us up and throwing us out. And finally, too, just want to stress that with big picture activism, it becomes so obvious that there is no point in blaming individual groups or individual classes or individuals. It's really about, let's look at this system, let's raise awareness about it, let's make awareness raising one of the most important activism, so that together, so we'll have more people to transform that system. Yeah.
Wonderful. So as a summary, to wrap things up quickly, I would say, and please correct me if you don't agree, that we need to basically focus on education and awareness raising for the moment to make people understand that the root cause of all our ails, or most of them, is globalization and growth. So the scale and the priorities of our current system, and that the cure, or part of the cure, has to do with relocalizing the economy in our lives and moving away from growth to well-being and happiness, and being part of something specific in your concrete community will give you a sense of identity and belonging that is fundamental to being humans and part of nature. Again, do you want to add anything to this conclusion, Helena? Otherwise, we'll move into the Q&A.
No, I think that's fine. Just very grateful for what you're doing, Jesus and Mar. Very happy that the book's going to get out in Spain. And just also to say that I really honestly believe that Spain can play a very important role in this whole movement. And it's because you have not urbanized and industrialized quite as drastically as in the Anglo world. In the sort of this alliance between the US, England, Australia, Canada, the memory of community, intergenerational connection, and an experience of smaller scale agriculture is more of a distant memory. And whereas in Spain, you have much deeper wisdom, because so many of you still remember that and still have some connection. And that's a fundamental part of the understanding. And this is, there's a lot more to say, but I'll just say that I'm very, very excited about working with you, and I hope that we'll have more communication and connection. And I hope, Jesus, that we can have a conversation also on World Localization Day. So I'll need to make a date with you to organize that.
Wonderful. I would love to be a part of that. It's a pleasure and honor, Helena. And now we'll just pose you a few questions for the next 10 minutes or so, and then let you go, because I think it's already quite late in Australia right now.
It's quite late. It's quite late.
I will not hold you for so longer.
Thank you.
So Rafael Burgos Santero wants to ask Helena her opinion about the end of a powerful source of energy, such as petrol, and the idea of peak oil. Is it closer now? What do you think of the soft doctrine? This has been developed by Naomi Klein. How can we counter the shock doctrine in this particular moment?
Did you say, what did you call the doctrine?
Shock doctrine.
Oh, shock doctrine, yeah. I thought you said soft. I thought maybe she'd written a new, something new that I didn't know about. Well, first of all, in terms of peak oil, from the very beginning, I had a lot of friends and colleagues, economists and others, Richard Heinberg, many, who were very convinced about peak oil, but because I'd ended up studying the global economy and this unbelievable takeover by big banks and the financial casino, I was trying to say that as long as we allow this creation of make-believe money at this level, which is not real wealth. I mean, it's really would, it mustn't go on too long. But anyway, as long as that's happening, then the fact that the oil reserves are harder to excavate, that it's going to be more expensive, will probably not be reflected in the price. Because I had already been writing 40 years earlier about the artificial nature of the price in the marketplace. I'd already been writing about how, a sack of potato crisps from the other side of the world would be much cheaper than a completely natural, local, organic potato. How is that possible? And we've been fooled into believing in efficiencies of scale. It's not about that. It's about control and about those hidden subsidies. And I hope that doesn't disempower people. To me, it's a very exciting prospect to realize how much of this craziness is built simply because we're too ignorant about the workings of the system. And it's not that difficult to explain how it's gone wrong and what we need to do to change it. So peak oil may not come. I mean, I'm unfortunately, the financial casino could live on until we cut down virtually every tree, fracked. Fracking is unbelievably inefficient and expensive. It's still going on because huge amounts of money are being used for this destruction. Sorry, what was the other question now? About the shock doctrine. Yeah, I feel that the only thing I would say about that, where I would differ a little bit with Naomi, is that I see a lot of people who support this mad growth economy and in effect are practicing a type of shock doctrine, but without being truly conscious of how destructive it is what they do. And I often use the example of many of my ecologist friends saying, well, nothing is going to change until we have some kind of major crash. And so they're also sort of waiting for a crash to bring in a more ecological way. And then, the people who are pushing this financial, neoliberal, crazy economics, they actually believe that this is the best way to go. So I'm not at all claiming to know the intention of everybody, and that there might not be some pretty greedy, unpleasant people at the top, as it were. But I often find that the farmer in the farmer's market that I will know personally and I know over a long period may not be much more generous and kind than people I've known who worked for Coca-Cola or in the finance markets. But it's not so much about individual values as it is the structures of being able to work in something that serves humanity versus something that's so destructive.
Wonderful. Actually, this is one of the main ideas that really struck me when reading your book, is that usually movements, we tend to create enemies, to work against them in a way. The fossil fuel industry, the apartheid in South Africa, we all had a clear, concrete enemies that people, could turn their eyes to and build a movement around that. But what you're saying is that let's not cast blame on the individual or the particular political party or government or business, but think that everyone is human and everybody is subjected to pressures from shareholders or or elected officials, etc. So the problem is itself the system that creates those pressures. So we need to understand that to avoid, this blaming back and forth. So yeah, wonderful.
Can I also say, though, I just want to add to that, I think an important distinction, which is that there are some people, very spiritually inclined people who are very resistant to essentially to being negative or critical about anything. And I'm saying that we need to be very clear that there are certain acts, there are certain chemicals, there are certain ways of doing things that are evil, but I don't see the people as evil. There are ways and systems. And so, for instance, I see, the creation of DDT and organophosphate pesticides and genetic engineering and many things that's extremely harmful. And their impact, because they're so destructive, you could almost call it evil. But it doesn't mean that the people who believe in that and who are pushing it, that we mustn't hesitate to be willing to say no to a certain development path, to certain materials, because we understand that the individual people in and of themselves are not necessarily conscious of how destructive it is. Nevertheless, it is destructive. Does that make sense? So it's like Gandhi apparently said, blame the sin, not the sinner. I really like that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, I actually believe, this is my personal view, that we need to move beyond considering particular individuals as good or bad or evil or angels, in the sense that we can all be good or evil in every action that we take. So it's not natural, what's called the nature of human beings, right? Being good or evil. It's what we do every day. So we can evolve, we can become better or worse.
Yeah.
Responsibility is something that we need to take and consider on our daily basis. It's not, nobody's good or bad. All right. So two last questions and we're done. So Juan Carlos Tojar wants to know about how can small and medium enterprises, SMEs, avoid having to be forced to, export to external and faraway countries and markets. How can they create a local market for their products and services when it's so hard to, build this consumer base, as you were saying before, of responsible consumption? And also, yes.
Well, I mean, actually, again, with this big picture activism, if you inform yourself about how these products are emerging, how people have started groups, there are various mechanisms that can be used. If you also, instead of saying to people, you should pay more for your food, and if you care about it, you should be buying only local organic. If you don't put so much value and blame on the whole thing, but look again at the systems where it's been truly beneficial for the consumer as well as the producer to come together. And it takes the education process to get more people convinced, and that education process can also be sometimes a study tour, maybe to a place where some of these markets have been set up. They might be a co-op, they might be a finance system that has helped local producers to get going, and sometimes with interest-free loans, sometimes with donations. There are wonderful examples of consumers paying a bit extra so that poorer people in their area can afford to buy the same local organic food from the farmer. So there are many models and examples. So it's a good idea to inform yourself about that and then just try to get the word out. People have used our film, The Economics of Happiness, to start new markets. It's been used in quite a few places specifically for that.
Wonderful. So yeah, please check it out. Economics of Happiness documentary on Local Futures. And the last question from Panie. She wants to know what's the linkage between localization and degrowth. and whether it is possible to degrow when our current mainstream education system is trying to push to be productive. So how can, and there's this, mainstream narrative of we need to produce more we need to consume more in order to create jobs, and this is the only way for us to redistribute wealth. How can you counter that narrative, and how can we, what's the connection between localization and degrowth in your opinion, Helena?
But this is where I feel so happy to have discovered the importance of the smaller scale and the local, because that is a difference between degrowth and localization, is that once you wake up to that, there are so many things that you can start on a smaller scale, an immediate scale, and basically so much of that localization movement has consisted of a few individuals getting together at the local level to start initiative. They didn't wait even for local government. Almost everything that's happened, from community energy, farmers markets, edible schoolyards, started with individual people, not local government, and certainly not central government. So degrowth tends to be focused more on the need to change policy at the national level and even internationally. Many of the thinkers, including the founder, Serge Latouche, he's a personal friend of mine. I've known him for 35, 40 years, and we're in almost complete agreement about what we want to see and our critique of the neoliberal economy. However, what I feel strongly is that for most people living their ordinary lives, when they hear the word degrowth, I think many would believe that, oh, I'm going to have even less money to pay my mortgage, to pay my rent. And so I believe that the message that we need to strengthen local economies everywhere can build a bigger movement faster, maybe. But maybe we need different forms of language for different people. However, there are also degrowth thinkers who I feel are still following a more conventional industrial path in their thinking. And so they're thinking more just about how do we create the welfare net, the UBI or social welfare, how do we create better healthcare, all very, very important. But it doesn't, and I would say now it's becoming urgent actually that this picture needs to be much more profoundly ecologically informed and psychologically informed, because the epidemics of depression, the disempowerment of people, the disillusionment with human nature, it's ailing people in a major way. So I feel we have a vision that is more energizing, that's more healing, that's more profoundly spiritual and psychological, that is really, really important, an addition to the very important degrowth movement.
Wonderful. So I think with that we can conclude and sort of recommend those who want to know more to attend the World Localization Day on June 21st.
Yeah.
You can find more info on the website and localfutures.org and worldlocalizationday.org as well. And that's it. I don't know if you want to say some final words, Helena?
But I don't know whether Anya or Laura, whether you want to say hello to everybody. Anya, mi amiga, habla español. Anya, ¿tú quieres decir algo? ¿En español?
Claro que sí. ¿Me pueden ver?
Ah.
Hola. ¿Sí me están viendo? Mucho gusto. Saludos desde Dinamarca. Me interesa muchísimo lo que está pasando en España, ya que viví allí muchos años, y también he estado colaborando aquí con Jesús y con Mar del editorial Pol-len. Y entonces sigo lo que está pasando en España con mucho interés y con mucha emoción. Igual como dice Helena, veo que hay oportunidades de cambios en España que no tenemos en muchas otras partes de Dinamarca y en otros países también. Entonces, pues también estamos viendo con mucho interés qué va a pasar allá con ustedes y todas las iniciativas que ya tienen en camino, y queremos colaborar más, definitivamente. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti. Sí. Y gracias, Jesús.
Gracias, Anya, Helena. Thank you so much. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Yeah.
Chao, chao.
Adiós, gracias a todo el
Adiós.
mundo.
Adiós.
Gracias por
Adiós,
estar
bye.
aquí. Adiós.